Pluralism. Introduction. The fact that people disagree fundamentally about morality, religion, and the good life is a defining and intractable feature of modern social life. It also raises a number of difficult normative questions for political theorists. For instance, can citizens who favor conflicting ethical, political, and religious ideologies agree about fundamental political values? Can a broadly secular society treat religious believers as equal and vice versa? And how should a society respond to individuals and groups who are profoundly skeptical about or even hostile to its basic values? In this chapter, we will explore three different ways in which contemporary political theorists have responded to questions like these. Political theorists use the word pluralism in a different way to political scientists. In political science, pluralism describes a political system in which power is dispersed amongst a number of actors or institutions. This application of the term can be both descriptive and normative. Meanwhile, for both political theorists, pluralism generally refers to value pluralism, which is a contested philosophical view about the nature of value. Value pluralism is best understood by comparing it to its opposite, monism. According to monists, there is a single ultimate value, which apparently different values such as beauty, friendship, courage, wisdom, and so on are reducible to. For instance, the utilitarian Jeremy Bentham was a monist who believed that valuable things were valued if and only if they contributed to the sensation of pleasure, which he regarded as the ultimate value. In contrast, value pluralists believe there are many different valuable things and that these cannot be meaningfully compared or reduced to another. When values cannot be ranked or compared, value pluralists call them incommensurable. Moral philosophers continue to disagree with one another about whether or not value pluralism correctly describes the structure of morality. Meanwhile, the political theorists we discuss in this chapter all accept value pluralism, albeit to different degrees. However, they disagree about how we should respond to the fact that people actually do disagree about basic and fundamental matters of religion, morality, and politics. Historically, such disagreements, and especially disagreements about religion, have been the source of political volatility and even violence. One historically influential solution to the discord unleashed by the fact of religious diversity was to institutionalize the principle of toleration by separating church and state. Formulated as a doctrine, as in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution or the 1905 Law on the Separation of the Churches and the State in France, this strategy makes two demands. First, states should refrain from imposing any particular religious orthodoxy on their members and from interfering in their religious liberties. Thus, it should not take no views about theological controversies and should tolerate a variety of religious beliefs and practices. Second, religious influence over political decisions should be minimized, and political power should be exercised for religious purposes. Proponents of the first theory that we examine in this chapter, political liberalism, identify two shortcomings with this doctrine. First, because it focuses narrowly on the issue of establishing peace amongst different religious groups, it neglects other forms of disagreement. Second, because its goal is stability and not legitimacy, it does not supply moral reasons for citizens to endorse their common political arrangements. In response to these concerns, political liberals have sought to explain how citizens who otherwise disagree about morality, religion, politics, and the good life can nevertheless reach a widely acceptable overlapping consensus about shared political principles. For them, the challenge of pluralism is not simply to reduce the likelihood of conflict, but it is to justify their terms of cooperation amongst free and equal people who hold very different views about the ultimate end and purpose of human life. Proponents of the second view we shall consider, modus vivendi, are skeptical about the possibility of reaching a meaningful consensus about the principles that should underlie an ideal political order. For these political theorists, pluralism runs deeper than political liberal acknowledge, and is naive to believe that we will find any genuinely shared political principles amongst our different worldviews. Instead, they argue that a stable peace may be the best we can aspire to, and that our best prospects for securing this are to find pragmatic compromises that the various groups in society might be willing to acquiesce to, even if they do not do so for reasons of self-interest. Finally, proponents of the third view, agonism, agree that pluralism runs deeper than political liberals acknowledge, and similarly rejects the goal of reaching a consensus about shared political principles. However, they also reject the goal of stability and instead celebrate the dynamic and transformative potentials of disagreement and conflict. Agonists aspire to a political disorder in which all governing principles are always open to contestation, and they are vary about the stifling effects of a political life that aspires to agreements and consensus. For these political theorists, the key challenge presented by pluralism is neither legitimacy nor stability, but is rather to convert potentially hostile forms of antagonism into antagonistic respect. Some of the most difficult challenges posed by pluralism in contemporary societies are related to cultural diversity, and in the second half of the chapter we will examine how proponents of the three rival perspectives have sought to address them. We will begin by exploring how political communities might respond to cultural differences and to controversial cultural practices. After this, we will focus more narrowly on the question of whether or not political liberalism responds fairly to the needs, perspectives and interests of deeply religious citizens. Then we will examine the relationship between pluralism and equality, focusing especially on the tensions between multiculturalism and feminism. Finally, to conclude this chapter, we will examine some of the ways in which our three rival perspectives have responded to the challenge of pluralism on the global stage. Rival perspectives. Political liberalism. How is it possible that there may exist over time a stable and just society of free and equal citizens, profoundly divided by reasonable religious, philosophical, and moral doctrines? Rawls in 1996. This is the problem that political liberalism addresses. To find out what is distinctive about it, we should begin by looking at how its proponents, such as John Rawls, Charles Larmor, Gerald Goss, and Stephen Macedo, understand the phenomenon of pluralism. According to Rawls, a modern democratic society is characterized not simply by pluralism of comprehensive religious, philosophical, and moral doctrines, but by a pluralism of incompatible yet reasonable comprehensive doctrines. No one of these doctrines is affirmed by citizens generally, nor should one expect that the foreseeable future of one of them or some other reasonable doctrines will ever be affirmed by nearly all citizens. Political liberalism assumes that for political purposes a plurality of reasonable but incompatible doctrines is the normal result of the exercise of human reason within the framework of the free institution of the constitutional democratic regime. Three features of this account are worth noting. First, pluralism includes philosophical and moral differences as well as religious ones. Second, under conditions of pluralism, citizens endorse rival comprehensive doctrines that are incompatible with one another. These doctrines cover the major religious consistent These doctrines cover the major religious, philosophical, and moral aspects of human life in a more or less coherent and consistent manner, and give rise to contrasting visions about the good life and about the ultimate purpose of political association. Third, deep religious, moral, and philosophical disagreements are to be expected in free societies. Pluralism is not a mere historical condition that may soon pass away, it is a prominent feature of a public culture of democracy. One reason for that is that the freedom of speech and conscience that liberalism insists upon make it almost inevitable that reasonable people will continue to disagree about ultimate questions. Importantly, the fact that citizens disagree about the nature and significance of basic morals and political values is not the result of bad faith or ignorance on their part. Rather, it follows from what Rawls called the burdens of judgments. These burdens have to do with things such as difficulties of assessing and interpreting evidence, the variances amongst people experiences, the vagueness of concepts, and the complexity of morals, political, and social issues. What Rawls' account suggests is that even citizens had the opportunity and desire to thrash out their disagreements about truth, morality, and religion. It is highly unlikely that they would come to any substantive agreements about them. Why should pluralism of this kind pose a challenge for liberal political theory? Peter Lassman answers this by identifying paradox of liberal justification. Liberal theorists have generally insisted that justifications of the exercise of political power must be available and intelligible for all citizens. However, if pluralism understood as the existence of conflicting but reasonable visions of the good is itself a product of liberal state, then this seems to limit the perspective of emergence of universally acceptable public philosophy. Liberal political regimes seem to create a state of affairs that undermines their own requirements for legitimacy. A stable political system must be willingly and freely supported by at least a substantial majority of its politically active citizens. Consequently, political communities require a shared conception of justice that can attract the support of most members, but at the same time, the possibility of agreement about values seems to be blocked by the inevitability of pluralism. Rawls' theory of political liberalism aims to overcome this paradox by making three important moves. First, Rawls rejects the idea that a shared conception of justice needs to be wedded to a comprehensive theory about human nature, morality, and truth. This possibility, of course, is what the fact of pluralism seems to rule out. Instead, he thinks that we can all agree to a more limited conception of justice provided that it satisfies two conditions, that is, fall entirely under the category of political and it is freestanding. A political conception of justice has a limited scope. It applies solely to a society's major social, political, and economic institutions, and do not have any other controversial questions about human life. Meanwhile, a freestanding conception of justice is presented independently of any wider comprehensive religious or philosophical doctrine, detaching the political conception from any particular comprehensive doctrine means that it will not compete with any of the moral and religious views already endorsed by citizens. Members should be able to endorse the freestanding political conception without abandoning their existing ideas about how they should lead their lives. Second, the aim of the freestanding political conception of justice is to attract the support of an overlapping consensus of reasonable, comprehensive doctrines. The political conception represents a kind of common ground that can be endorsed by adherents of rival moral and religious traditions. Followers of these different traditions might endorse the shared conception for quite different reasons, including ones that are rooted in their own comprehensive doctrines and which are rejected by their fellow citizens. Importantly, citizens themselves will regard their shared political conception of justice as part of their own broader beliefs about morality, and not simply as something they go along with for strategic purposes. As Rawls conceives of it, the political conception is a module, an essential constituent part that fits into and can be supported by various reasonable comprehensive doctrines. Third, citizens will be able to agree on a political conception of justice only if they put aside their comprehensive moral and religious conceptions. Political liberalism asks that the members of a political community adopt a particular style of deliberation, which Rawls terms public reason, when they address fundamental political questions. According to this view, citizens must refrain from appealing to controversial doctrines when justifying their views about basic political matters, and instead draw only from a limited pool of widely accepted reasons and arguments. Like the civic virtue theorists we examined in chapter previous one, Rawls requires citizens to internalize some demanding attitudes and dispositions. The ideal of citizenship imposes a moral, not a legal duty, the duty of civility, to be able to explain to one another on those fundamental questions how the principles and policies they advocate and vote for can be supportive by the political values of public reason. The union of the duty of civility with the great values of the political yields the ideal of citizens governing themselves in ways that each thinks the others might reasonably be able to accept. There are two aspects of the case in favor of duty of civility. First, the pragmatically public debate will quickly reach a stalemate if partisans of rival comprehensive doctrines insist on making assumptions and counter-assertions that can be understood in terms of their incompatible understandings of the whole truth. Consequently, in order to achieve consensus, they must restrict themselves to standards of reasoning that they shared by their fellow citizens and to values which are widely accepted. Second, and morally, it would be unreasonable for partisans of particular comprehensive doctrines to seek to impose their worldview on others who disagrees, since political power is something in which each citizen has an equal share. Modus vivendi. Political liberalism is a much more ambitious doctrine than the separation of church and the state because it combines liberalism's historical concern with social peace with a demanding theory of legitimacy. According to Rawls, the basic institutions of society are legitimate not simply if they deliver stability, but only if the principles underlying them also solicit an overlapping consensus. This requires that citizens do more than merely acquiesce to the principle governing the design of society's major institutions or accept those institutions for strategic purposes. Rather, they must recognize the underlying principles as being in some sense their own. To illustrate what he means by this, Rawls contrasts his view with the modus vivendi, which he characterizes as a consensus of accepting certain authorities or on complying with certain institutional arrangements founded on the convergence of self or group interests. As an example of such an arrangement, he discusses the uneasy toleration of Catholics and Protestants in 16th and 17th century Europe. On his reading, this pragmatic pact for civil peace entered into for reason or mutual self-preservation, lacked stability for the right reasons, because had either group been able to do so, they would have imposed their own religious doctrine as a sole admissible faith. The lessons Rawls draws from this is that it is dangerous for citizens to affirm their arrangements as being only second best, since this will lead to a weak commitment to a political order. Larmok makes shifting distribution of power in a similar point by arguing that modus vivendi sentimentals are hostage to the shifting distribution of power. Individuals will lose their reasons to uphold the agreement if their relative power or bargaining strength increases significantly. Meanwhile, a number of contemporary liberals such as John Gray, Bernard Williams, and John Horton have embraced a modus vivendi view, albeit one that differs from Rawls' own description of it. For those authors, the purpose of modus vivendi is to secure social order, minimize violence, avoid disruption, and protect society against great evils such as civil wars. Its proponent acknowledges that many citizens may regard it as a second-best outcome, but even if mere modus vivendi will very often be preferable to the status quo, a modus vivendi simply requires an agreement that delivers peace for whatever reason and however rough and ready. and it drops the requirement that members must affirm a shared political conception of justice. Like political liberalism, it requires that citizens accommodate one another and accept common institutions. But unlike political liberalism, it does not require citizens to reach an overlapping consensus about principles of justice. As Shorten puts it, a modus vivendi only requires a kind of shared willingness to acknowledge the legitimacy of some particular set of political arrangement. For its supporters, this makes the modus vivendi approach a more realistic and workable proposition. John Gray's defense of the modus vivendi approach emphasizes its anti-utopian credentials. A theory of modus vivendi is not the search for an ideal regime, liberal or otherwise. It has no truck with the notion of an ideal regime. It aims to find terms on which different ways of life can live well together. Gray in 2000. On Gray's account, the modus vivendi approach is the authentic higher to classical liberalism because it accepts the full force of value pluralism. Political liberalism took liberalism down the wrong path by putting so much emphasis on consensus, and in doing so, they neglected the deep truth that humans will always have reasons to live differently. While political liberals tend to view disagreement about values as a regrettable consequence of the human limitations that can be overcome through public reason, modus vivendi approaches instead view value conflicts as deep and irresolvable. For Gray, there are many different ways of life, which cannot be rationally ranked and amongst which no single vision expresses the best way to live. The conflict amongst these different ways of life cannot be overcome by setting on common political values, since there is no guarantee that any such value exists. In support of their view, contemporary advocates of the modus vivendi approach draw attention to three important aspects of pluralism that seems to be brushed over by political liberalism. First, they point out that pluralism is as much a political phenomenon as a philosophical one, and it is more often experienced in the form of conflicts amongst groups with competing interests than a philosophical disagreements among individuals with different ethical beliefs and ideals. Proponents of a modus vivendi are skeptical about solving the problem of pluralism through the seminar room exercise of finding common grounds against rival ethical system, because the tough case that must be settled are rooted in the rival claims of life. These deeply about the political allegiances, as in Northern Ireland, or they might come from groups that not only have different ethical beliefs and ideals, but also refuse to associate with one another. In these cases, finding common philosophical grounds seems to be much less urgent than settling on a workable modus vivendi. Second, advocates of a modus vivendi argues that political liberals do not pay enough attention to political power and how it is distributed. Political liberals operate within a stylized and highly abstract model of politics in which free and equal individuals with different comprehensive moral doctrines attempt to reach an overlapping consensus through public reason. But real political bargains are not at all like this. They are made amongst political unequals and are often the product of negotiation, compromise, persuasion, and even threats. Because the theoretical construct that sustains political liberalism is unrealistic, it cannot help to guide our practical reasoning about what we should actually do in the here and now. Third, proponents of modus vivendi also think that political liberals overestimate the extent to which liberal values are widely endorsed. Although, quite essentially, liberal concepts such as rights and freedom are frequently invoked in political discourse, there is little real agreement about their meaning. Think, for example, about the disagreements amongst those who favor a right of life and those who favor a right of choose with respect to abortion. Similarly, any shared commitments to liberal principles often seem to be at least very thin. In reality, though there is unprecedented lip service to them, most late modern societies contain little consensus on liberal values. Many people belong at once in the liberal form of life and in communities which do not honor liberal values. At the same time, many who stand chiefly in liberal ethical life do not subscribe to some of its traditional values. The liberal ideal of personal autonomy is the idea of being part author of one's life. For some, the pursuit of autonomy comes into conflict with allegiances to an established community. For others, it is a tension with the freedom to respond to the need of the power. The worry that Gray expresses here is that the prospects for reaching an overlapping consensus that is recognizably liberal are bleak. If this is true, then committed liberals might be better off setting for a mere modus vivendi. A modus vivendi is reached when numbers A modus vivendi is reached when members of a society accept some set of political arrangements, even if they do so reluctantly, and even if they regard those arrangements as second best. As Shorten points out, there is no guarantee that a modus vivendi will always issue in an outcome that would generally be regarded as liberal, and one could be struck on terms that might not conform to liberal principles. This had led some political theorists to conclude that regardless of the attractions of the modus vivendi, it is not a liberal theory. However, liberal defenders of the approach have sought to placate this worry, as we explore. Agonism. Both modus vivendi and political liberal approaches offer different solutions to the problem of pluralism. While political liberals want to resolve deep arrangements by locating common political principles that everyone can endorse, proponents of the modus vivendi believe that our best hopes for civil peace rest with forging practical accommodations that appeal to the self-interest of followers of different ways of life. Meanwhile, advocates of an agonistic politics such as Chantal Mouffe, William Connolly, and Bonnie Honig have advanced a radical critique of the rationalistic pretensions of both approaches. Agonists are not just skeptical about the possibility of rational consensus, but are hostile to the idea. For them, a politics of agonistic confrontation is preferable to the search for an inaccessible agreement. Recent formulations of the case for agonism have issued mainly from philosophers sympathetic to post-structuralism. Post-structuralism describes as intellectual movement that emerged during the second half of the 20th century and was strongly influenced by the writings of French philosophers such as Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, whose work we will consider in great detail in Chapter 6. Its followers reject appeal to objectivity and truth, instead arguing that meaning is dynamic and fluid, constituted through complex operations of power. A characteristic post-culturalist moves into destabilize its foundations upon which our knowledge claims are based. In order to reveal the precarious contingency of our settled beliefs, the influence of post-structuralists thinking is especially reflected in three features of the agonist projects: its questioning of supposedly stable cultures, its questioning of supposedly stable categories and concepts, its skepticism about overly rational approaches to political problems, and its attentiveness to the pervasiveness of power in social relations. Each of these can be seen in the radical rethinking of pluralism that agonists propose. First, on the agonistic view, the pluralism of contemporary societies is not just amongst different people endorsing different comprehensive moral doctrines or following different ways of life. Rather, pluralism is an axiological principle that reaches much further than liberal acknowledges and includes the categories and ideas we use to make sense of political life. For instance, agonists stress that political concepts, as well as philosophical ones, are not fixed or stable entities, but are rather produced by distinctive histories of political contestations. This kind of deep pluralism is reflected, for example, in Connolly's depiction of politics as an ambiguous and relatively open-ended interaction of persons and groups who share a range of concepts but share them imperfectly and incompletely. The implication of this is that because the concepts which are used in political discourse are radically plural and unstable, any arguments or consensus that we believe ourselves to have reached are likely to be fictitious. Second, agonists criticize rational approaches to politics, including modus vivendi and political liberalism. Not only do these approaches fail to recognize the importance of political passions, but they are also exclusionary because they involve removing from public contestations those things which mark us out as different. For example, Rawls' notion of public reason excludes controversial religious doctrines if they do not contain reasons that would be acceptable to non-believers. Although this strategy offers a way to settle the problem of pluralism, it does so by relegating religious differences to the non-political sphere. On an agonistic interpretation, this purported solution is really nothing more than an evasion of the oppositional dimension of politics. As Moore sarcastically remarks, for Rawls, a well-ordered society is a society from which politics has been eliminated. Third, on an agonistic reading, the liberal approach to pluralism is hypocritical because it serves to disguise the role of power in shaping actual political agreements. Political liberal aims to treat people as equal by favoring political principles that are accepted to all, but at the same time, they exclude controversial view from politics on the basis that they are not widely shared. Although political liberals themselves present this exclusion in terms of the universal morality, agonists stress that it is actually deeply partisan and political. This is because on their accounts, what is perceived as reasonable and what is perceived as unreasonable will always depend on the traditions, discourses, and power relations that are currently in circulations. Thus, excluding purportedly unreasonable views from political discourse serves to reinforce the prevailing hegemony of the dominant tradition. Agonists adapt a hard-headed attitude towards politics, regarding it as a space of power, conflict, and antagonism. Passionate disagreements is built into the nature of modern democracy, and the liberal project of smoothing over pluralism by removing it from public contestation is fatally undermined once we recognize the ineradicable characteristics of antagonism. Nevertheless, agonists do not think that pluralism should be left to run riot, and they acknowledge that some limits need to be put to the kind of confrontation which is going to be seen as legitimate in the public sphere. The aim of limiting political confrontation in this way is to transform antagonism into agonism, and this is achieved by altering the terms upon which people regard their political opponents, so that they no longer perceived as an enemy to be destroyed, but as an adversary, that is, somebody whose ideas we combat, but whose right to defend those ideas we do not put into question. Connolly makes a similar point, referring to the possibility of moving from an antagonism in which each aims initially at conquest or conversion of the other towards an agonism in which each treats the other as crucial to itself. This is achieved by cultivating agonistic respect, which is a civic virtue that allows people to honor different final sources, to cultivate reciprocal respect across difference, and to negotiate larger assemblages to set general politics. Cultivating this virtue will make citizens both friends and enemies of one another. They are friends because they share a common symbolic space, but also enemies because they want to organize this common symbolic space in a different way. Moore concludes that converting antagonistic opponents into respectful agonistic adversaries is the real meaning of liberal democratic tolerance, which does not entail condoning ideas that we oppose or being indifferent to standpoints that we disagree with, but treating those who defend them as legitimate opponents. Agonists cite two main advantages of their approach. First, an agonistic politics is well placed towards of the twin threat of citizen passivity and enmity. On their account, both the theory and practice of liberalism have negative effects because they tend to discourage citizen engagements. For instance, Bonnie Honig worries that the displacement of politics by law and administration engenders remainders that can disempower and perhaps even undermine democratic institutions and citizens. Similarly, Mao thinks that a consensus-oriented politics directed towards minimizing confrontation will lead to apathy and dissatisfaction and disaffection with political participation. This is because politics is an inherently partisan activity, and for people to be interested in politics, they need to have a possibility of choosing between parties offering real alternatives. What agonists recommend is a richer, more partisan and more dynamic political politics that will comprehensively engage the passions of a citizen. At the same time, however, respectful agonistic contestations offer a pressure valve for political passions, thereby reducing the risk of an explosion of antagonisms that can tear up the very basis of civility. The second advantage claimed by proponents of agonism is that their approach opens up political space for the creative reconfiguration of social and cultural identities. Because social and cultural identities are contested within public life and not hidden away in the private sphere and immunized from criticism, citizens will be exposed to new and different ideas and their identities will be put under pressure. According to proponents, agonistic contestations will help to prevent people's identities from becoming settled, fixed, and entrenched, and will instead encourage the emergence of more flexible, contingent, and overlapping identities. As Connolly puts it, when democratic politics is robust, when it operates to disturb the naturalization of settled conventions, when it exposes settled identities to some of the contestable contingencies that constitute them, then one is in a more favorable position to consider some of the demands built into those conventions and identities. Agonistic confrontation might mean, for example, that new reconfigurations of gender will become possible, or that new religious identities emerge when the old ones are put under public scrutiny. The dynamic subversion of social and cultural identities that agonists anticipate will no doubt be a disturbing experience for many people. But because the experience of having one's own identity put in question will be shared by all, this may discourage antagonistic hostility. For instance, in reference to religious differences, Connolly describes an ideal in which people respectfully contest their religion's beliefs and then suggests that this will be agonistic in two senses. You observe the agony of having element of your own faith called into question by others, and you fold agonistic contestations of others into the respect that you convey to them. Because the possibility of having one's identity challenged is shared by everyone, this may discourage the kinds of passive hostility that minorities are currently exposed to and in contemporary societies. Key debates. How should society respond to cultural diversity? Some of the most pressing cases of pluralism in contemporary politics are so because they involve the intersection of value pluralism and cultural pluralism. Consider, for example, the fierce controversies surrounding the publication, initially in the Danish newspaper, of cartoons depicting the Islamic prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which are discussed, or alternatively think about the opposition of many Jehovah's Witnesses to blood transfusions. In cases such as these, different cultural groups seems to be divided because of their opposing value system and worldviews. Indeed, it is sometimes suggested that multiculturalism raises the stakes of pluralism because of the special significances that people invest in their cultures and identities. For instance, while people are sometimes willing to back down in ordinary political debate, they may be less inclined to do so when their identity is at issue, and this may make the achievement of rational consensus, stable agreement, or agonistic respect more difficult. One proponent of modus vivendi approach, John Gray, has drawn an explicit link between value pluralism and cultural pluralism, defining cultural pluralism as a condition in which society intimates a diversity of possibly incommensurable values and worldviews. Since Gray believes that a modus vivendi approach follows from an acceptance of value pluralism, he also thinks that a modus vivendi approach is the best response to multiculturalism. Whether or not one is convinced by this will depend on three things: whether one believes that value pluralism is true, whether one believes that value pluralism entails a modus vivendi approach, and whether one believes that cultural pluralism is a form of value pluralism. All three of these claims are contentious. Other defenders of the multicultural modus vivendi, such as John Horton and Jacob Levy, have developed theories that do not depend upon controversial views about the value pluralism and its relationship with cultural pluralism. For these thinkers, a major attraction of the modus vivendi approach is that it seems to offer a realistic prospect for securing peace and stability amongst rival ethnic, cultural, and religious groups. For example, Horton cites the case of the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, which he thinks succeeded largely a system of power sharing amongst the two main communities in Northern Ireland, and consequently was able to detoxify a deep-rooted and persistent religiously defined conflict. Horton emphasizes that this messy ragback of a document was a result of backroom bargaining and compromises amongst groups looking out for their own interests. The preceding political negotiations followed no established procedure, theory, or principle, and political negotiations followed no established procedure, theory, or principle, and were pretty much made up as the process developed. The implication that Horton draws is that hard participants in the peace process being limited to the kind of rare-feed approach advocated by the political liberals, they would have been unable to make the necessary compromises. A more general defense of modus vivendi multiculturalism has been suggested by Chandran Kukatas. Kukatas compares a multicultural society to an archipelago, suggesting an ideal in which different cultural groups achieve peace and stability by agreeing to leave one another alone. This is the radical version of the mosaic multiculturalism discussed in Chapter 2, and each group in society is in effect left to govern itself. Kukatas characterizes this as a liberal vision, since it realizes a particularly demanding version of the principle of toleration. Of course, some groups in society, such as religious fundamentalists, might reject both liberalism and principle of toleration. Nevertheless, they might be convinced to go along with the archipelago-type arrangements on modus vivendi's grounds, because they too have an interest in peaceful coexistence. One consequence of this view, as Kukatas acknowledges, is that it gives considerable power to the group, denying others the right to intervene in its practices, whether in the name of liberalism or any other moral ideal. Critics have been especially worried about this, because it potentially leaves weaker group members vulnerable to oppression or exploitation. While modus vivendi approaches to cultural differences tend to lean towards a mosaic form of multiculturalism, agonistic approach lean closer to the hodgepodge ideal. For them, multiculturalism offers the exciting prospect of multiple and complex agonistic engagements across differences. For its proponents, respectful agonistic encounters are to be celebrated because they will disturb settled cultural identities and disrupt hegemonic political ideas. For example, according to Connolly, a democracy infused with the spirit of agonism is one of which divergent orientations to the mysteries of existence find overt expression in public life. Space for differences to be are established throughout the play of political contestations. The terms of contestations enlarge opportunities for participants to engage the rational and contingent character of the identities that constitute them. And this effect, in turn, establishes one of the preconditions for respectful strife between parties who reciprocally acknowledge the contestable character of the fate that orient them and give them definition in relation to one another. Connolly acknowledges that in order for the politics of democratic agonism to flourish, the politics of generalized resentment must be subdued. However, he does not supply much concrete guidance about how this might be achieved. Critiques of agonism, such as Monique de Vaux, have expressed skepticism about agonism's potential to subdue resentment in culturally diverse societies. For example, de Vaux writes that the claim that an agonistic model of democracy could foster greater inclusion of diverse citizens as well as mutual respect between communities will remain an ineffectual bit of rhetoric in the absence of clearer ideas about how we can formalize such inclusion and recognition. Moreover, she speculates that agonistic engagements with the emphasis on conflict and disagreements could turn out to be counterproductive, leading to the entrenchment of social and cultural identities and making it more difficult for diverse cultural communities to see that they do share at least some social and moral views, norms, and interests. What Devue and the agonists agree about is not the value of expressing an engaging cultural difference, but rather the form that such engagement is likely to take within a society that adopts a positive attitude towards conflict and disagreement. Meanwhile, some multiculturalists have begun to develop more nuanced explanation of how society might encourage respectful engagement across cultural differences. One example of this is Bhikkhu Parikh's model of intercultural dialogue, which shares some features in common with both political liberation and agonism. Parikh is concerned to find out how culturally diverse societies might deal fairly with disputed practices such as female genital mutilation, polygamy, animal slaughter methods, arranged marriages, and ritual scaring, and he observes a multicultural society is likely to include communities some of whose practices offend against the values of the majority. It cannot tolerate them indiscriminately because it has a duty both to raise its voice against morally outrageous practices and to safeguard the integrity of its own moral culture. However, if it disallowed all that disapproved of, it would be guilty of moral dogmatism and extreme intolerance and would miss the opportunity to take a critical look at its own values and practices. This raises the question as to how a multicultural society should decide which minority value and practices to tolerate within what limits. In common with the political liberals, Parikh thinks that these kinds of controversies should be settled through a dialogue and aim towards consensus. However, like the agonist, he acknowledges that real political dialogue does not come out of nowhere, but instead always occurs within a particular social, cultural, and political context. Thus, for him, intercultural dialogue cannot be freestanding and neutral, but many always begin from the prevailing values of the society. But unlike the agonists, he does not regard this as a form of hegemonic dominance. Rather, prevailing values are a helpful starting point for discussing disputed practices because they can make the unfamiliar seem familiar. Intercultural dialogue. On Parikh's model should be oriented around society's operative public values. He thinks that most societies already contain a set of dominant values and practices that are part of its moral structure and are embodied in its major social, economic, political, and other institutions. These operative public values form a complex and loosely knit whole and provide a structured but malleable vocabulary of public discourse. They are values in the sense that adherents cherish them, endeavor to live in accordance with them, and refer to them when evaluating the behavior of others. Meanwhile, they are public in the sense that they are embodied in laws, institutions, and practices, and because they regulate the public conduct of citizens. Finally, they are operative in the sense that they are not merely abstract ideals, but are generally observed and constitute a lived social and moral reality. Importantly, these values are not fixed, but instead are malleable and may change as circumstances alter. Similarly, they are not neatly structured and will often overlap measily with one another and be subject to varying degrees of public contestations. While some citizens may reject these values, they are nevertheless a generally reliable guide to how do we do things here. These values do not pretend to be neutral amongst different cultural traditions. They embody a distinctive way of life reflecting a shared history and a partial perspective about what it is to be a human being. As a consequence, they will often be experienced as burdensome by cultural minorities who endorse very different value commitments. How can operative public values be used to arbitrate about disputed practices? Parikh rejects the idea of using them as a crude and non-negotiable standard. Instead, he favors an open-minded dialogue about the relationship between the disputed practice and the operative public values. Importantly, and in contrast to public liberalism, Parikh places no limits to invoke. Moreover, he emphasizes that this kind of dialogue has no fixed destination and could have the kind of transformative potential that agonists celebrate. For instance, intercultural dialogue might lead to a minority group deciding to abandon a controversial practice by fostering a debate within that community about its legitimacy. But alternatively, it might also encourage majority society to reconsider its own values and their skepticism about the practice. The effects of dialogue will be difficult to predict and will depend upon the practices and values that are under contestations, as well as the dispositions of the dialogical partners. The important thing is that dialogue gives both sides the opportunity to learn about one another and to consider their views in light of the arguments, stories, and perspectives to which they are exposed. As a consequence, intercultural dialogues may make for more informed and considered public policy as each group is allowed to present its case. Furthermore, dialogue may help to embed the democratic culture, assisting in the cultivation of the virtues of tolerance, reciprocity, and open-mindedness. An interesting, perhaps surprising, and certainly unegonistic aspect of Parikh's approach is his reluctance about demanding rapid transitions in a society's operative public value. For instance, after a dialogue about a disputed practice, Parikh thinks that if the majority remains unconvinced about it, then their values should prevail. He gives 3 reasons in support of this. First, the operative public values are woven into the society's institution and practices, which cannot be radically revised without causing considerable moral and social disorientation. Second, majorities do not have a duty to accommodate minorities if doing so threatens their own way of life. Third, minorities and especially immigrants should defer to majorities in continuous matter in order to counter the resentment their presence generally provokes among some sections of the society. A further controversial point about Parikh's approach is that the terms of intercultural dialogue are established by the different views present within society and do not make reference to universal moral values. Some liberal critiques, such as Brian Barry, worry about this. For instance, suppose that a society contains a large number of racists, and that the operative public value of the society reflects this. Parikh's approach seems to require that if an ethnic minority cannot convince the majority to alter its value, then it should defer to majority preferences. Is political liberalism fair to religious believers? Political liberals are committed to the ideal of justificatory neutrality. This means that any justification we give, especially when discussing constitutional essentials, but perhaps also when considering a law or a policy, should not depend upon controversial ideas about which other citizens reasonably disagree, such as religious doctrines. Within this view, public reason operates as a kind of constraint on the ideas that are allowed to enter into political reasoning. This aspect of political liberalism has inspired a substantial critical literature, and in this section we will look at 2 serious objections to it: that political liberalism's claim to neutrality is unfounded, and that political liberalism unfairly discriminates against some religious believers. The first objection has been advanced by both multiculturalists and communitarians. The basic claim that the political liberalism, like most other forms of liberalism, does not actually supply an impartial framework within which different moral and political views can resolve their differences. Rather, political liberalism is itself a contested doctrine that stands amongst the different view within society. Parikh, for example, thinks all forms of liberalism advocate a specific view of man, society, and the world based on a particular cultural perspective, and as such cannot provide a broad and impartial enough framework to conceptualize other cultural perspectives and their relations with it. For skeptics like Parikh, Rawls' theory presupposes a conception of man and society that this is not found in other traditions or thoughts. In addition to struggling a set of controversial cultural assumptions through the back door, political liberalism also have been accused of promoting distinctively liberal way of life. On the face of things, this accusation seems perplexing, since the aim of political liberalism is to find a mutually accepted political conception of justice and leaves intact whatever comprehensive moral doctrines are currently in circulation. The problem, according to its critique, has to do with the conception of citizenship that political liberalism depends upon. And we have seen Rawls thinks that citizens must have a significant degree of the political virtue and be willing to take part in public life. The political virtues that citizens must exhibit include such things as toleration and mutual respect, a sense of fairness and civility, a spirit of compromise, and a readiness to meet others halfway. The importance of these virtues is clear. If citizens lack them, then it would be difficult for society to sustain democratic political institutions. If these virtues are necessary, then society seems to have a duty to promote them. For instance, through its school system, but promoting particular and controversial values seems to contradict the ideal of leaving the various comprehensive doctrines intact. Some of the difficult issues this tension gives rise to are discussed in great details. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that children can be socialized into accepting the political virtues of tolerance and civility without jeopardizing their comprehensive and moral doctrines. The problem do not end here for political liberalism. Since the doctrine also seems to be committed to promoting the value of critical reasoning, this is more controversial because, as political liberal Stephen Macedo notes, Promoting core liberal political values, virtues such as importance of critical attitude towards contending political chains, claims seem certain to have the effects of promoting critical thinking in general. Even a suitably circumscribed political liberalism is not really all the circumscribed. It will in various ways promote a way of life as a whole. The value of critical reasoning is rejected by a number of comprehensive moral doctrines. For example, religious believers who accept scriptural authority as the whole truth may regard adopting a critical attitude towards religious texts as dangerous and heretical. Indeed, Rawls himself acknowledges that people may have, and often do not have, at any given time, affections, devotions, and loyalties that they believe they would not, indeed could not, and should not stand apart from and evaluate objectively. What his position seems to require is that all citizens accept the value of critical reasoning within the political lives and in their public capacities as citizens, but that no member of society be required to accept the value of critical reasoning in their non-political lives. But as Macedo points out, this might be impossible to realize in practice. The second objection to political liberalism is that the ideal of public reasoning unfairly restricts the democratic freedoms of religious believers. Recall, political liberals say that we should avoid making sectarian appeals to controversial doctrines, and our fellow citizens might reasonably reject when we are discussing constitutional essentials or basic matters of political justice. Instead, they think that we have a duty of civility to uphold the ideal of public reason, which means accepting the reasonableness of pluralism and adopting a restricted mode of political discourse, namely one in which we respect the freedom and equality of our fellow citizens by confining ourselves to commonly accepted truth of science and history, as well as shared fundamental ideals implicit in the public political culture. One objection to the ideal of public reason is that society itself could lose out if religions were excluded from political debate, since this would disallow many movements, many praiseworthy forms of political activity. For instance, consider the abolitionist movement, which sought to outlaw slavery in antebellum America, or the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King. In both of these cases, political activists used deeply religious speeches to support their causes and did not always back up their arguments in terms that would satisfy the stringent demands of public reason. Another objection to the ideal of public reason is that not everyone can accept it, which is a possibility that Rawls himself acknowledged. Those who believe that fundamental political questions should be decided by what they regard as the best reasons according to their own whole idea of truth, including their religious or secular comprehensive doctrine, and not by reason that might be shared by all citizens free and equal, will of course reject the idea of public reason. Public liberalism views this instance on the whole truth in politics as incompatible with democratic citizenship and the idea of legitimate law. For example, some religious fundamentalists reject the idea of reasonably pluralism and, as a consequence, are unwilling to uphold the duty of civility. For them, a single religious truth really does exist, the rejection of which is always an error, and the truth should inform the use of political power. Furthermore, and perhaps more troublingly, Rawls appeal to public reason could even be treated non-fundamentalist religious believers unfairly, preventing them from invoking religious reasons during political discourse. This could lead to a kind of split identity problem in which religious believers end up hiding some of their values where deliberating about important political matters. Some critics worry about this will diminish religion, turning it out into a kind of hobby. Worse still, others think that bracketing of religious beliefs is in fact an effect to ask people to annihilate essential aspects of one's very self. This could be because, for instance, religious beliefs are core beliefs that give meaning and purpose to many lives. Two of the different strategies that political liberals have deployed in response to this line of objection are explored even further. Can pluralism and equality be reconciled? The relationship between pluralism and equality is fraught because some individuals and groups reject the value of equality, such as orthodox or fundamentalist religious groups. As a result, respect for pluralism may be incompatible with the principle of equal treatment. In this final section, we will examine how the three rival approaches have balanced the competing demands of pluralism and equality, focusing especially on the case of sexual equality. Proponents of the modus vivendi have said at least about equality, which they tend to regard as one of those ideals with which they have no truck. Nevertheless, three distinctive features of the modus vivendi theory of equality can be identified. First, strong value pluralism of the kind that some modus vivendi theorists endorse seem to rule out definitive statements about the principle of equal treatment requires. This is because different worldviews embody rival accounts of human interests, and these generate different understandings of equal treatment. Thus, John Gray concludes that there is no best interpretation of what equality means or requires. In this strong form, Gray's view casts doubt on any principled attempt to pursue a strongly egalitarian program of government. Second, equality could nevertheless perform an important instrumental function in the modus vivendi if a perception of equality treatment could help to secure whatever compromises are necessary for political stability. Something like this idea can be found in John Horton's interpretation of the Good Friday Agreement. This agreement was recognizably egalitarian in that it affirmed a principle of parity of esteem amongst the Catholic and Protestant communities. Moreover, this positive instrumental valuation of equality is consistent with Gray's skepticism, since what mattered for Horton was the agreement achieved its purpose of securing peace. From a modus vivendi point of view, nothing significant would have been lost had the agreement been reached without the egalitarian principle of parity of esteem. Third, where there is a conflict between respect of pluralism and the principle of equal treatment, advocates of a modus vivendi will tend to say that the former takes priority over the latter. Chandran Kukatas outlines a strong version of this view, arguing that attempts to promote one can only be made at the expense of the others. For instance, consider the example of groups that are internally unequal because their cultural traditions are hierarchical. According to Kukathas, equality can only be upheld across society if we forcibly override the cultural practices of these groups. Controversially, Kukatas applies the same logic to the case of sex equality, arguing that the aims of feminism and multiculturalism will often clash with one another because some cultural groups do not grant female members equal dignity or equality of opportunity. In such cases, his view is that toleration should prevail, even for groups that deny women the right to hold property, limit their access to education, and practice forced marriages and female genital mutilation. Meanwhile, liberal feminist authors have criticized Kukatas for not taking liberalism commitments to freedom and equality seriously enough. They agree that feminism and multiculturalism are in tension, but say that securing women's equality is more important than tolerating cultural differences. Liberal feminism therefore demands much more than a modus vivendi can be guaranteed to deliver. Perhaps the parties to the modus vivendi will accept gender equality, in which case there needs to be no trade-off between equality and pluralism. However, if the different groups are not willing to endorse women's equality, then feminist and modus vivendi variants of liberalism must part company. Although the tension between feminism and political liberalism are less stark, feminists have raised two objections to this theory. First, political liberalism, because of its emphasis on consensus, is said to concede too much ground to comprehensive moral doctrines that do not take women's equality seriously enough. Consequently, the principles of justice delivered by political liberalism may be inadequately egalitarian. Second, political liberalism, because of its restricted political scope, is too reluctant to intervene within associations such as a family, which are often important locations for the reproduction of gendered form of inequality. Can political liberals promote inequality amongst the sexes, at least to a more demanding extent than a modus vivendi? On the other hand, political liberals are strongly committed to tolerating a wide diversity of moral doctrines. If political principle must be justified to all members of society, then it may turn out to be the case that any principles that are capable of soliciting an overlapping consensus will be weakly egalitarian at best, and therefore inadequate from the feminist point of view. On the other hand, Rawls himself is clearly concerned about sex inequality. For instance, in the preface to Political Liberalism, he writes that the same equality of the Declaration of Independence which Lincoln invoked to condemn slavery can be invoked to condemn the inequality and oppression of women. Similarly, in the later essays, he describes the equal rights of women as inalienable, and argues against the application of gender distinction in the distribution of rights and liberties. An important issue here concerns the extent to which political liberalism must accommodate comprehensive moral doctrines that do not respect equality between the sexes. Clearly, when political liberalism grants free speech rights, it must favor a wide degree of liberty, even for groups and individuals who wish to proselytize on behalf of sexist ideals. But at the same time, political liberalism rules out such groups and individuals imposing their ideals on others. If those ideals do not respect the freedom and equality of women as citizens, this means that this group are entitled to encourage their members to follow traditional gender roles, including deeply unequal ones, providing that society itself upholds a substantive ideal of equal citizenship. For many feminists, the bargain that political liberalism strike with patriarchal group does not go far enough, since it conceivably permits sexist groups considerable discretion within the domestic sphere. Martha Nussbaum expresses the quandary in which political liberalism finds itself as follows. On the one hand, the family is among the most significant arenas in which people pursue their own conceptions of the good and transmit them to the next generation. The fact suggests that a liberal society should give people considerable latitude to form families as they choose. On the other hand, the family is one of the most non-voluntary and pervasively influential of social institutions and one of the most notorious homes of sex hierarchy, denial of equal opportunity, and also sex-based violence and humiliation. These facts suggest that a society committed to equal justice to all citizens, to securing for all citizens the social basis of liberty, opportunity, and self-respect, must constrain the family in the name of justice. Rawls himself was notoriously ambiguous on the question of whether or not this theory sanctions interventions within the family, and we will return to this issue again. Meanwhile, sympathetic critics such as O'Kane have argued that if political liberalism is really committed to equal respect for persons, then it must also be committed to the critique of the traditional patriarchal family. One reason why intervening within families might be important, for example, children are reared so that they internalize inegalitarian ideas about the proper gender roles of men and women. They may become citizens who are incapable of respecting the equal status of women. Finally, the egalitarian potential of egoism rests primarily on the emancipatory possibilities that could follow in a wake of transformation in the symbolic order. Recall, one aim of egoism is to allow for the deconstruction of the apparent naturalness of settled identities and instead to make it possible for new identities to emerge. If it is the case that dominant norms and identities reinforce inequality, then egoistic confrontation with its potential for challenging and transforming these norms and identities may conceivably have a radical and egalitarian impact. Consider, for example, the case of inequalities within the family, such as the unequal division of domestic labor. One possible explanation for such inequalities remaining widespread, despite the participation of both men and women in the workplace, has to do with essentializing tendencies of prevailing ideas about gender. For instance, dominant binary constructions of gender inequalities, of gender identities, allocate distinctive role to men and women and associate each with discrete bundle of tasks and responsibilities. These prevailing ideas may have the effect of trapping people into settled identities, stereotyping men and women, and preventing them from configuring new ways of relating to themselves and to one another. Meanwhile, agonistic confrontation may reveal and nourish new possibilities, allowing people to create new identities and to blur traditional division between the genders. However, critiques of agonism cast doubt upon the egalitarian potential of post-structural forms of political theory. In particular, they emphasize that post-structuralist skepticism about universal reason and foundational moral values such as justice and equality leave it unable to fully address substantive issues of inequality. For instance, in an earlier work written by Ernesto Laclau, Mauve characterizes the term equality as the floating signifier, the meaning of which depends on the context and the discourse in which it is articulated. For them, equality has an essentially ambiguous meaning which can be temporarily fixed as a result of discursive political struggle. The approximate aim for the feminist politics on this view is to work towards establishing a particular understanding of equality as the dominant one. Pragmatically, such a strategy might have profoundly equalizing effects if it were to succeed. However, given the post-structuralist reluctance to accept fundamental foundational political claims. It is difficult to see what theoretical resources would be available to us to condemn the persistence of gender inequality if the discursive projects were to fail. Future challenges. Pluralism raises challenges not only within political communities, but also between them. Consider, for example, the difficulty of reaching global consensus about complex issues such as regulation of the global economic order, the practices and institution of the international relations, and how to respond to the environmental crisis. Not only is there disagreement about which solutions to favor, but there is also disagreements about how to understand these problems and about what values are at stake. By way of the conclusion, I will briefly sketch out how our three rival perspectives might respond to the challenges presented by pluralism on the global stage. The modus vivendi approach has been applied on international politics by realist scholars of international relations such as E. H. Carr, Hans Morten Tau, and Reinhold Niebuhr. Realists believe the conflicts and struggles over power are the basic components of international life, and they criticize utopians and idealists for failing to appreciate that relationship between states are inevitably governed by self-interest rather than morality. Realists make two important points about the role and self-interest plays in international politics. First, they argue that the world is self-interested actors can be a stable one, but only in a very limited sense. Realists accept that powerful states will always dominate weaker states if they are given the opportunity, but since each state has an interest in its own survival, alliance will form to bring about the balance of power. Such a system will be stable in the sense that it will be able to enable the general structures of the state sovereignty to persist, but it will not be peaceful, and war will remain an inevitable feature of international life. Second, realists also argue that attempts to reach consensus about political values, such as human rights or democracy, are unfeasible if they conflict with the interests of powerful actors. Indeed, on a realist worldview, value talk in international politics is more likely to be rhetorical disguise used by dominant states to further their own self-interest, goals, and projects. Meanwhile, some political liberals suggest that a deeper form of international stability might be possible and are more optimistic about the prospect of the consensus about the human rights and other political values. For example, in a work written towards the end of his life called The Law of People and discussed in later chapter, Rawls outlined his visions for the realistic utopia in which different political communities formed an international society of people by agreeing to shared principles for regulating global society. Rawls argued that different states could agree to respect the freedom and independence of one another, to uphold treaties and agreements, to honor a limited set of human rights, and to observe restrictions in the conduct of war, although he acknowledged that there are constraints on the kind of consensus that might be possible at the global level. Since disagreement about fundamental moral, religious, and political values will be deeper at this level than within a state political community, he also suggested that cooperation amongst different political communities would increase as societies developed affinities for one another, such that they would no longer move simply by self-interest but by mutual concern for each other's way of life and culture. By rejecting the realist assumption that self-interest is always the dominant motive in international affairs, Rawls suggests the possibility of the deeper kind of international stability based on the widely shared allegiance to the law of people. 2 points are especially worth noting about Rawls' approach. First, it is a minimalist view, and he does not anticipate different political commitments agreeing to the kind of substantive principles that he thinks the members of a single political community could agree to, such as principles of distributive justice or even rights to freedom of expression and association. Second, the agreement he envisages about the law of people obtains only amongst liberal democracies and what he calls decent consultation hierarchies. He accepts that some outlaw states might refuse to comply with the generally recognized principles of international cooperation, and instead thinks that a sufficient reason to engage in a war is that war advances or might advance the regime's rational interest. Finally, agonists have at least 3 reasons to be skeptical about Rawls' project of establishing a realistic utopia. First, like realists, they are doubtful about the prospects of reaching a meaningful and sincere consensus about shared principle at a global level. Although different political communities might pay lip service to the idea of sharing common values, for instance, by signing up to human rights agreements, agonists emphasize that these agreements are likely to be superficial and unstable. Second, They also object to Rawls' exclusion of societies that do not qualify as liberal or decent. For them, this unfairly privileges the kind of views that are commonplace in wealthy societies, such as Rawls' own. Third, they also worry about the consequences of the global politics oriented around consensus. For example, Mauve characterizes Rawls' approach to international politics as profoundly alarming and likely to lead a war. For her, the very project of attempting to reach a consensus about global principles risks stifling legitimate expressions of dissent and instead encouraging more militant form of antagonistic politics. End of chapter.